I saw some reports coming into our foundation that were uniquely better than reports that I had historically seen. And I wasn't the only one noticing it, right? Like my community represented review team members were noticing it. And I thought, what's happening here? And it was because they were providing, in addition to that quantitative data, they were providing some powerful stories and context and identifying some of the ripple effects of the types of work that they'd been carrying out, which gave a much more comprehensive picture of the type of impact they were having in the community. This method, which engages, everything from appreciative inquiry, which is very strength-based model for sort of asking questions, what action steps have you taken? What changes are you most proud of? It gets people thinking about what has worked well, and it moves people into that positive mental space. We ask at the end of the session, what are your reactions to the experience of this ripple effects mapping session today? And consistently we get inspiring, motivating, hopeful, connecting, reflective. Gone are the days where evaluation needed to stand outside and try to be as objective as possible. It's sort of like, look, we need efficient tools that get people through to understand impact, and this reinforces that people are having a positive experience as they move through the evaluative process as well.
Why is measuring our nonprofit's impact on the world necessary for funding from donors and foundations? And how on earth do we do that? And how does it improve the work of our nonprofit? Well, we're going to find out the answers today on Nonprofit Docs. Our expert guest today is Janet Hansel, and I'm your host, Dr. Marc Hardy. Janet Hansel brings 3 decades of nonprofit philanthropic expertise to her role as founder and managing consultant of Grant Street Consulting, LLC. Drawing from her 15-year tenure as Chief Impact Officer at the Community Foundation of Tompkins County in central New York, Janet champions approaches that build trust, deepen collaboration, and cultivate a culture of continuous learning and adaptation for nonprofits and their funders. She specializes in mapping techniques such as ripple effects mapping, or REM, and asset mapping. Janet Hansel and her team guide organizations through evaluation and strategic planning processes that weave together collective storytelling, visual mapping, and appreciative inquiry, which is a very interesting concept. Grant Street Consulting's clients include foundations, higher education institutes, nonprofits, and international entities such as the World Bank Group. Now based in the vibrant city of Tucson, Arizona, a community known for its rich cultural heritage, stunning desert landscapes, and strong spirit of social innovation, Janet joins us to talk about the ripple effects mapping, asset mapping, and how we can prioritize a healthy nonprofit sector during these times of uncertainty, including the challenges of potential federal program cuts. So welcome, Janet Hansel, to Nonprofit Docs. And I know you're an expert in many things nonprofit, but today we're going to talk about evaluation and what is the ripple effect of programs and organizations and so on and so forth. But I have to tell you, evaluation is not easy. People freak out when they go, oh, evaluation, oh, how am I going to do this? Do we really need evaluation? And if so, why? Where do we start with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for having me, Mark. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about evaluation and all things mapping today, which is my most recent passion. So I'm excited to be here. And yeah, so I work with a lot of nonprofits and funders and have worn each of those hats myself through the years. And evaluation's very important. I think any nonprofit that is trying to get resources from funders, from their individual donors, from their many, foundations, private foundations, community foundations, as well as government funding, as uncertain as it can be these days. Evaluation certainly serves the purpose of being able to report out your impact to others, but also we are driven to do this work in the nonprofit sector because we're passionate about our missions. And if we're passionate about our missions, we also want to have, build in feedback loops to understand, are we making an impact and how do we know we're making an impact? And so evaluation can play a really important role in understanding our own impact in the work that we do.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about mapping and a ripple effect. I am so into ripple effect. I believe everything we do has a ripple effect. To measure that, I think, is a big challenge. And but what I've realized in my study of philanthropy is over the last probably 30 or 40 years, you've seen this movement from people giving because they love the charitable cause and they're willing to, if they're Catholic, they'll give to Catholic charities. If they're Lutheran, they'll give to Lutheran services. If they're in a Rotary Club, they give to Rotary concerns because they do good things. I mean, it's obvious. They feed the hungry, they house the unhoused, they do a lot of good things. But what I have seen is I've seen going from we're going to give to charity to help people who are in need to we want to see the social ROI on our
Right,
investment because the
right.
problems that we've been giving to for 10, 20, 15 years are the same as they were then. And so, how have we made progress? So, they're more interested in return on their investment on a social level, not
Mhm.
a financial level. And does this help do that? Does this help kind of frame that?
Yeah. Yeah, you're hitting right on how sort of I got exposed to this particular model, which was years ago. I was the chief impact officer at a community foundation in Ithaca, New York, and I had been for many, many years, fielding and managing the grants out to these nonprofits, many of them small grassroots organizations to far larger, more well-established nonprofits doing good work in the community. And I saw some reports coming into our foundation that were uniquely better than reports that I had historically seen. And I wasn't the only one noticing it, right? Like my community represented review team members were noticing it. And I thought, what's happening here? And it was because they were providing, in addition to that quantitative data, they were providing some powerful stories and context and identifying some of the ripple effects of the types of work that they'd been carrying out, which gave a much more comprehensive picture of the type of impact they were having in the community. So I did some digging and I found out that there was a team from Cornell University, which is in Ithaca, that had been working with those organizations with this method called ripple effects mapping. And so started learning a little bit more about ripple effects mapping, found out that two of the founders of REM, which we affectionately call REM, Deborah Hansen and Lori Higgins, had been at Cornell, come out of their practitioners within cooperative extension that come out of the Washington State University and University of Idaho that had developed this ripple effects mapping process out of the community capitals framework. So a lot of lingo here that comes from the evaluation world, but there's a lot of evaluation frameworks and they were addressing this issue of evaluations needing to be relatable, that really shared the human story and the human impact of the types of work that had been carried out by an organization. So this
And that
team
that
at
helps that helps the nonprofit go heart to heart with whoever they're communicating with, right? It's not just about the statistics. It's about the
exactly.
stories behind the ripple effect.
Exactly. And ripple effects mapping sometimes complements other quantitative techniques to do evaluation. Of course, we realize that nonprofits are very limited sometimes in their capacity to carry out substantial evaluation of their services. Doesn't mean they can't be engaging feedback loop tools and things like that to learn, but nevertheless. So eventually I brought this group from Cornell into my community foundation and wanted to experience it ourselves. Like we wanted to evaluate our services, right? And so I was getting sort of trained in ripple effects mapping in the process, learning how they did it. So they convened a group of our grantees, and then they convened a group of our donors. and use method which engages, everything from appreciative inquiry, which is very strength-based model for sort of asking questions. What action steps have you taken? What changes are you most proud of? It gets people thinking about what has worked well, and it moves people into that positive mental space. And it's a very participatory approach. It's very inclusive. It allows everybody in the room, whether virtual or in person, to sort of engage. And then we use mind mapping software in real time to add people's feedback to the map, and it creates a very engaging and very generative environment for getting feedback, and documents it, which is really, really important. There's a number of outcomes I can talk about ripple effects mapping, but that's how I got introduced to it. And I fell in love with mapping in the process. And now it's a core part of the services that I provide in my consulting practice and with community groups and beyond.
Well, I agree with you. It's badly needed. I hope we do a little bit deeper dive into appreciative inquiry because I think that is a game changer. A lot of
Mm.
organizations are only focusing on what didn't work and how can we fix it. And appreciative inquiry, of course, is let's focus on what did work and let's do more of that. And it's kind of in the realm of the positive psychology movement. And I love that stuff. And I hope we'll expand on that. Where do we start with this as a nonprofit? Where do we start? How do we use this stuff? Can we go into that now?
Yeah, great question. So I keep finding this model to be just expansive, like using it in different environments. So its core use is to draw out both the intended impact of a program's work as well as the unintended impact of a program's work. And it works really effectively in very complex systems, so coalitions or collective impact or those types of settings. But even within organizations, there's a lot of complex systems going on, right?
Right.
And I love that space where we bring transparency and clarity from complex things to more, to greater understanding. So for example, I've used this in an environment of an early childhood education coalition where they were operating from sort of a theory of practice, for particular goals they were trying to reach. So much of the results that was coming out reflected those specific goals of the organization. But some of the unintended results were that these, young professionals who were attending these coalition meetings regularly started to learn about all these other early childhood organizations. And when a position became vacant, they were then applying to other positions, and they were personally experiencing a lot of professional growth. And it was, of course, inadvertently then keeping people in the field, a field that has a lot of turnover, right? And so that was one of the unexpected results of a coalition, if you will. And that kind of thing would not have probably surfaced without sort of everybody being in the room and with a prompt, telling their stories to each other about what were they proud of, what were their accomplishments, and it got, it spanned both the individual personal experiences with the broader organizational impact.
So when we talk about ripple effect, we're not just talking about the effect of the programs or the organization on the populations that they're helping. We're talking the total ripple effect, maybe on the board of directors, on the staff, on maybe the community that was never intended to be helped. Maybe they are helped. Is that basically what we're talking about here?
Definitely. We've done that. We did this with a community college foundation, for example, and we convened generally in small groups. These were all virtual spaces. This can be done in person or in the virtual space very effectively. And we convened a group of first the board members. We then did a ripple effects mapping session with staff. We then did one with the college leadership, one with community partners, and one ultimately with scholarship recipients, those who were, very impacted by the work of a community college foundation. And you start to see different themes emerge out of that work about what's been effective. And then when you're able to take those maps and analyze those maps and start to see what themes span all of those groups, you can really get at valuable information about where the impact of this foundation is. And in that particular situation, it was actually used to help position the board for readiness to do some strategic planning that was good, that they were kind of dragging their feet on. So sometimes when this can be used in spaces of anticipated change management or strategic planning, definitely reporting back to funders about the impact of programs, so many valuable opportunities to use the results of it.
Now, it sounds to me, and I actually taught this at Notre Dame, but I never taught mapping. I taught about
Mm-hmm.
measuring your social impact and all that, but I had never heard of this mapping process until you told me about it. It's very interesting, but it sounds to me this is about more than just proving to your funders you're doing a good job. This is about basically a management tool for the entire organization. Would I be correct in that?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of we decide with each client initially, like what do you hope to get out of this? You know, who's your target audience for your final maps, your final report, or sometimes we're brought in just to do the experiential component of it, like almost like in a team building setting. So for example, we had an organization that had new leadership, and the new leadership knew that a culture shift was in need from the team. And we just came in, and in that case, the prompt was just to sort of, share a story about a time you've been a part of an effective team and why it was, how it supported your strengths, why it was meaningful to you. And they were drawing from everything from previous work experiences to like, summer camp, and in the process of identifying what made a good team from the past, it was also shaping their vision for what they wanted their team to look like. So pretty much consistently, this is another reason why I fell in love with this tool, is that we ask at the end of each of these, we do them in 2-hour sessions typically. We ask at the end of the session, what are your reactions to the experience of this ripple effects mapping session today? And consistently we get inspiring, motivating, hopeful, connecting, reflective. Gone are the days where evaluation needed to stand outside and try to be as objective as possible. It's sort of like, look, this we need efficient tools that get people through to understand impact. And this reinforces that people are having a positive experience as they move through the evaluative process as well. And people just come away from these with their minds on fire, ready for like action, next steps. What do we do? It's extremely generative. And so often when you're doing this, for example, with program participants, they're just providing much more full stories about how the work of an organization has benefited them in their lives. And so it really draws out some wonderful stories, quotes, content, things that we need in the nonprofit world. And it also really fosters that culture of assessment and adjustment. As a funder for many years, I wasn't always looking for the report to come back to say, oh, this is what we said we were going to do. We did it exactly. Yay, big green check next to our things. I was really looking for more evidence of, do you have a learning culture? Are you setting up feedback loops that you're hearing from those whose your mission is in service to? And are you assessing and adapting your services accordingly to always be in a responsive, positioned in a responsive way? And this is, a great tool to move an organization toward that kind of internal culture.
I had an old acquaintance and friend who worked for a very large foundation in the state of Michigan, and he headed up the education division, and he retired. We had a very frank discussion one day, and he said, "Mark, I'm going to admit to you now that I'm retired that I think that 65% of the grants that we made failed." And he said, "I'm not sure how
Mm,
we increase that." His comment was, when we get reports that say everything went as planned and everything's wonderful and it worked out just the way we planned, he said, I'm pretty suspect of that. He
yeah,
said, when I get a thing that says, well, we tried a few things, they didn't work, so we adjusted and we tried a few other things, and this is what we found out, which is, I think, what you're talking about, the learning organization. He said, then I was impressed because that meant that, first of all, they were being truthful. They didn't
right.
have 100% success. They had some failures. They adjusted to the failures. And if they did it again, this is how they would do it. And so I'm thinking that doing a ripple effect evaluation system like what you're talking about would certainly point out those pros and cons of any program or organization.
Exactly. There's such an inherent power imbalance between funders and grantees that constantly needs kinds tools of bridging, and certainly the field has moved more into trust-based philanthropy, which is wonderful, but we're all learning together. And I would always tell grantees that, like when you're sharing with us what you learned, my favorite question to add on a report was, if you could go back and do this again, what would you do differently? It felt like the magic question to me. It was when they'd actually say, well, this really, messed up, and at this
Sure.
stage, and so that's when you'd start to see that culture of learning. And yeah, so just any opportunity to share with them, like when you show us what you've learned, we're learning as well. But I've been on both sides of that. I mean, ripple effects mapping is a great model to do in sort of the collective impact environments too, where there's funders might not be in the room, but the spaces that are created with REM tend to move people toward, well, consistently move people toward more authentic sharing. And so getting away from that, like, oh, who's in the room, but really getting into authentic sharing about what is working and what we can do more of. And these are all the reasons that I fell in love with it initially. And it's been getting a lot of traction. I'm serious. It's got a lot of international traction. It's taking off, and I know there's a lot of attention in England on it right now that's been used. I've used it in the international setting with groups like the World Bank Group and trained others to use it. People who are monitoring and evaluation professionals that are seeing that some of their quantitative tools are falling short. How can they incorporate this? So it's really getting great traction.
Bill Gates, in an interview several years ago, said something that is stuck in my mind forever. And he said, one of the best things that foundations can do, funders can do, is tell the truth about their failures.
Oh,
Because, foundations like everyone, likes to claim success, of what they funded. I mean, that's why nonprofits sometimes are not totally truthful on the reports because they don't want to look bad. But he was saying, look, we could save each other a lot of time if we knew what worked and what didn't. And the only way we can do that is to say, we tried this and it didn't work. So we wouldn't advise you to do it this way. We'd advise you to do it that way. I like that you're talking about this kind of growing trust and honesty because we're trying to solve some of the most vexing problems the world is facing. And we have to be honest so that we can move forward faster, so we can be more efficient and all that. So let me ask you, if a nonprofit says, hey, I'd love to get Janet down here and help as her and her team, where do they start? I mean, is there I know not one size fits all. You probably have to do some kind of assessment, but where do you start with all this? To me, it's kind of overwhelming because I know evaluation entails quantitative, qualitative, all kinds of surveys and things like that. So where do
yeah.
we begin?
I mean, so I belong to a community of practice that includes the founders of ripple effects mapping, as well as a lot of academics and community groups. We meet regularly and share expertise with each other, but also just what you said, like this didn't go well. Everybody tell their story of what didn't go well and why and how to do it better, right? We need more of those environments to learn from one another. So I do a lot of just exploratory phone calls, right? So, and nonprofits, don't be afraid to initiate those conversations with your funders, I mean, as a program officer for many years, I loved those conversations. I was there cheerleading and championing those grantees just as much. And it's fun to explore those opportunities for evaluation together. So initiate those conversations, be curious, ask those. But yeah, so obviously if people reach out to Grant Street Consulting, I'm happy to have those conversations about what do you need or who might you be talking to. And we have a strong network of, others that we can sort of refer people to advance those conversations based on geography or a whole host of other issues. There's specifically with ripple effects mapping, there's a field guide to ripple effects mapping, I think out of University of Minnesota Publishing, that we can put a link to, that is a great academic text on the value of it. But other than that, like there's just those of us who are sort of trained in it that are advancing it. So talk to us. Talk to us is a great way to get started.
And what I have realized over the last couple decades used to be that foundations were not real enthusiastic about funding evaluation.
Yeah.
right? They wanted to fund programs. But I see over the years, they have quickly realized that two things. Number one, funding salaries is important, funding operating expenses, but also putting in saying, part of your grant proposal can be 10% on evaluation. I know the federal government grants, one of them that we use, they insisted that we have an outside person to evaluate a program. It was over $1 million grant, but we paid $25,000 a year to have a consultant come in every year and evaluate the program. So funders, whether they're government funders or private funders or whatever, often will say, yeah, we'll fund the evaluation if you give us a budget. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that many foundations sort of have, opened their eyes to recognizing that evaluation is a core part of capacity building, and capacity building is what many funders are after. So I do see more support. There's also more support for those types of institutions like centers for healthy nonprofits that are housed within community foundations or are affiliates of community foundations that are trying to strengthen the sector, and they're providing more evaluative services that are accessible. And sometimes foundations are coming together to pool their resources to foster more evaluative resources, or like Listen for Good is an organization that's been getting a lot of national attention. And I would always encourage applicants of grants to include evaluation in. I think that shows you have a culture of assessment adjustment, right into your grant proposals, that an evaluation piece as from the get-go from your program, as opposed to just maybe applying for evaluation, but build it into your larger requests and be proactive. Thinking about those up front has been valuable.
Now, we talked about outside evaluators coming in, but I think what I hear you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you don't necessarily have to do that. And so you can do the evaluation yourself, given advice and things like that. How do you keep it from getting skewed, I guess, because if you're in the organization, not outside the organization, how do you be objective on that evaluation?
That's a great question. I think that's always a question, in this work. To your point about internal evaluation. So another thing that's happening is we're seeing more from large nonprofits that are trying to build evaluation into their organizational cultures, asking for training and ripple effects mapping. So we've done trainings as well, like the one I mentioned earlier. And it's a great resource for and great evidence that an organization is building that assessment and an adjustment culture internally. But they're, I think, teaming up with higher ed institutions locally and getting other sets of eyes on your work and building in some checks and balances is really valuable at every level. At the beginning level, what's the model? How are you going to use the model? How are you developing this? And then your data, and actually teaming up with those outside, because REM does lend itself to exporting it from the mapping software, coding all of the input, in really generating a lot of quantitative data behind the scenes, frankly, that if you want it to meet the level of rigor that some government or other funders are gonna require, it definitely lends itself to that. So, but I think that's part of the relationship between funders and grantees as well, is building out that trust, building out those checks and balances, and accessing those external resources.
We have covered the power of ripple effects mapping, or REM, to help you evaluate your nonprofit programs and organizational successes. If you like what you're watching, let us know by liking the video and commenting below about what other subjects you would like nonprofit docs to cover in the future. But please subscribe only if you are a nonprofit professional, volunteer, or board member who is serious about learning more about how to lead and manage a nonprofit organization. You are the people we are making these videos for. Now, we continue our conversation with Janet Hansel to discuss how nonprofits can engage in ripple effect mapping and evaluation. How long does it take? And most importantly, how much does it cost? In this next video, right here.